We will have been streaming for a while at that point. This one is over an hour. So buckle in, folks, because we've got stuff to do. Um, all right, here we go. All right. So the video we have here is In Defense of Puritanism by Atun Shea. I like Atun Shea. I've checked out some of his Civil War videos. That's what he's really popular for. But I'm not as big into the Civil War. I think it's a fun conversation to have with people who are willing to have an honest conversation on it, but it's overall kind of a pain to talk about online. I was looking into some of his other stuff though, and he has a decent catalog of videos. He's covered a wide variety of subjects that aren't just the checkmate Lincolnite stuff. And this one was actually sent to me. It's In Defense of Puritanism. Puritans, they get a bad rep. Rightfully so to a degree. I think we do have to acknowledge that some of that is very much earned. Puritans are known for not being any fun, which is true in a lot of ways. Maybe not always as bad as they are made out to be sometimes, but sometimes they do rise up to that reputation. It's hard to judge a whole group of people with like a broad, paint them with broad brushstrokes. It's not always fair, but I do think this is going to be a ton of fun. I've been doing some research around the Puritans recently, and I'm curious what's going to be coming up here. I am always wary of the In Defense of videos, because that title itself, like, you don't have to defend something, but you're choosing to defend it, which often causes people, and I've seen this, to work backwards from their conclusion to defend what they're defending. So it's not my favorite framing device, but it could be fun. It's definitely going to be an interesting subject. So yeah, for anybody who's hopped in, warnings on screen, but I'll read it for you anyway. This video contains flashing lights and images which may affect photosensitive viewers. So be wary of such things. We're going to be here for a while. Oof. Let's go. I love how accurate some of this is. So these are S's when you're reading stuff from this time period. The S's are written so weird, and I never get used to it. This here, that's an S. It's just how they did it at the time, you know? When I go to read primary documents, I have to, like, retrain my eye to see this as an S, even though it looks kind of like an F, like a lowercase f. But that's something you'll often find when working with primary sources. Oh, this is his Witchfinder character. I don't know much about this except for the cameo and the Checkmate Lincolnite stuff, so if I don't get any of the references, bear with me. I gotta check that out from the beginning. But we're doing this one today.
On April 1st, 1649, a handful of farmers gathered on St. George's Hill in Weybridge, Surrey. They broke out their spades and hoes and began to dig furrows for planting crops. On its face, it was an unremarkable scene of pastoral English life, one that had repeated time and time again across the country throughout the centuries. But this time was different. St. George's Hill was common land, owned by the lord of the manor. In times gone by, peasants could utilize common land for personal use under a wide variety of circumstances. But widespread agricultural enclosure had turned these semi-public spaces into, effectively, the Lord's private property, and by the mid-17th century, its use was tightly controlled. By planting on this hill, these farmers were breaking the law, which is exactly what they intended to do. For the next 5 months, they would occupy St. George's Hill in an act of defiance, not only against feudalism...
I like the camera attached to the shovel there. I love that he chose to do that. He didn't have to, he just went out of his way to do that.
Power itself. The group's charismatic leader, a fiery revolutionary named Gerard Winstanley, had this to say to England's ruling class.
The power
citations
of
in the corner.
land and on in property was brought into creation by your ancestors by the sword, which first did murder their fellow creators, men, and after plunder or steal away their land, and left this land successively to you, their children. And therefore, though you did not kill or thieve, yet you hold that cursed thing in your hand by the power of the sword, and so you justify the wicked deeds of your fathers, and that sin of your fathers shall be visited upon the head of you and your children, to the 3rd and 4th generation, and longer too, till your bloody and thieving poor be rotted out of the land.
The Diggers, as they became known up on St. George's Hill, caused a national stir, and no wonder. Their ideas are radical even by today's standards. They may seem to be centuries ahead of their time, but the Diggers didn't consider themselves to be terribly forward-thinking. Their ideology was firmly rooted in the Puritan movement of 17th century England. Their justifications were biblical. Winstanley maintained that social and political hierarchies were base, human inventions, devised to further the power of a privileged few. He reasoned that God had never intended for one group of men to lord over another. Instead, humans and animals should share the bounty of the natural world as a common treasury for all.
Yeah, an interesting thing about the Puritans, whether you like them or not, I feel like they're very often very well grounded in biblical justification. I don't know specifically about this case, but there's a lot of things that I've read about them where they catch a lot of flack. There's a wonderful... I'm going to have to get that book and actually link it sometime. I can't remember the title because I've read it in excerpts. But it's a story about the history of Christmas, which I read a few months ago. And the Puritans get a lot of flack for not celebrating Christmas in the early days of the United States, even though a lot of people didn't celebrate Christmas. Some people make it out as if we didn't celebrate Christmas at all. We did. It was just different. But the Puritans typically did not, and they get a lot of flack about that from people reading about them, like, oh, they're no fun or whatever. But they at the times like saw it kind of as the pagan holiday that it was at the time, and that it was there wasn't really any biblical grounding that they could justify the holiday through, and that it was just a really rowdy holiday that went against what they stood for. And it seems like a pretty principled stance. So often Puritans, when they get flack, often it is when they're standing by their convictions a little bit harder than people typically do. We have a lot of people who are like lean into Christianity, but they're not super strict about it. And a lot of the Puritans they would spit at that. I mean, probably wouldn't spit, but you know, they wouldn't get that. Like, if you're not going to go all the way, then like, what are you doing?
Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden. By June of 1649, the Diggers had generated enough alarm within the halls of Parliament for Thomas Fairfax, Commander-in-Chief of the New Model Army, to ride to Surrey to investigate these mad lads and lasses and learn more about their strange ideas. Famously, in one meeting, Winstanley and his compatriot William Everard refused to acknowledge Fairfax's rank by removing their hats in his presence. Fairfax, they said, was but their fellow creature, and besides, they had bought their hats to wear on their heads, not hold in their hands. The Diggers' fame burned brightly but briefly, and they quickly fizzled out as a movement, partially due to a lack of support from their fellow commoners, and partially due to systematic sabotage by the local lord. But their ideas are strikingly modern, the power of their words cutting through time like a knife through butter. Shockingly, for their time and place, they believed that all men were created equal. Today, St. George's Hill is a private gated community with a golf course, tennis club, and over 400 luxury estates with an average sale price of £4 million.
That didn't work out too well, did it?
Fucking Elton John lives there.
Think of pure.
I didn't realize how cinematic this was going to be. I'm so used to him like just sitting in front of a camera and talking in character, but just that. This is actually some really fun filmmaking material. It's not what I expected.
Puritan, and what comes to mind? A dour, conservative religious bigot with a penchant for witch hunting, probably while wearing a buckled hat. There was certainly a great deal of bigotry within Puritanism, and some of them did hunt witches, but conservative, far from it. This video will argue that Puritanism was not a vestigial remnant of a superstitious medieval past. It was a radical, progressive social justice movement that profoundly shaped the modern English-speaking world.
Yeah, the Puritans, as I know them, are the American Puritans, and there are definitely going to be some difference that if I'm talking about them, I'm often referring to my knowledge of American Puritans, which, if there is any major differences, I hope he highlights them in this. But yeah, like my knowledge doesn't really span across the ocean all that well.
The buckled hats, by the way, are a bizarre Victorian fantasy, kind of like horned Viking helmets. First, let's determine what a Puritan was. The term as we understand it today applies to several different religious and political sects, with diverse and often contradicting ideas about the will of God, the nature of man, and the ideal society. These people did not call themselves Puritans. That was one of the slanderous monikers given to them by their enemies, along with precisians and hypocrites. Those in the movement refer to themselves as saints, professors, and the godly. Unlike other branches of the Protestant tree, they were largely unorganized, at least at first. In their minds, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and even Calvinists had sold out once they became institutionalized. They betrayed the ideas of the Reformation and conceded to the moderates, or worse, the hated Catholic Church. So
Smelly
by their
Catholics.
very nature, Puritans were not a monolith. Even people within the same Puritan subgroup could differ significantly in their political opinions and religious values, but generally, the movement as a whole agreed on one foundational principle. The English Reformation didn't go far enough. At its core,
I've been studying the founder of my state, Roger Williams. He founded Rhode Island. So Rhode Island it's kind of, so he goes to Massachusetts Bay Colony to be among the Puritan immigrants there. And religious freedom over there is kind of like a one-way street. While today, a lot of us think about religious freedom like, hey, you believe what you want, I believe what I want, and as long as we're not hurting each other, like, who cares? But in the case of the Puritans that went over the Atlantic, they felt that if they didn't fight against like Catholic sentiment, if they didn't really secure like their Puritan utopia, then they weren't doing it right. Like, it wasn't religious freedom for all, it was religious freedom for them. Like, if the Catholics have their religious freedom over there, we need to go a place where we have our religious freedom, and we are able to freely shut down all the other religions, which ends up happening a lot. Roger Williams was a bit more of like the modern sort of religious freedom guy. He had the idea of the wall of separation between church and state long before Thomas Jefferson became so famous for that idea. And he ends up branching off, and Rhode Island ends up becoming one of the more religiously tolerant places in the country, like alongside places like Pennsylvania. So we ended up being pretty diverse.
Puritanism was a populist movement, and Puritans attempted to break down all cultural and institutional barriers that they believed stood between the individual Christian soul and the majesty of God. Catholicism, with all its pomp and circumstance, its extravagance, its mysticism, was diametrically opposed to this goal. Catholics weren't just misguided, Puritans thought, they were malevolent. The Pope and his clergy were intentionally pulling the wool over their congregants' eyes, preventing Christian believers from experiencing a personal knowledge of God. Catholic rites were seen as idolatrous, even demonic.
Puritans are, in this sense, purely Christian. I don't know if there's any other religion that would have, like, it's possible there are other sects that would, in other religions, that would resemble the sentiments of Puritans, but in this case, they're Christians.
Indeed, while most reformers regarded Catholicism as corrupt and wayward, Puritans believed that the Pope literally pledged allegiance to Satan and toiled in his employment. Inevitably, this notion led to widespread paranoia and anti-Catholic bigotry among the vast majority of Puritan sects. The godly were always on guard against Catholic influence, real or perceived, on English churches, and popish plots were imagined to be behind every political reversal for the movement. In 1629, as Arminianism, a Protestant sect that rejected Puritans' idea of predestined salvation, gained popularity across England, Member of Parliament Francis Rouse warned his countrymen to
look into the belly and bowels of this Trojan horse, to see if there be not men in it ready to open the gates to Romish tyranny and Spanish monarchy. For an Arminian is the spawn of a papist, and if there come the warmth of favour upon him, you shall see him turn into one of those frogs that rise out of the bottomless pit. And if you mark it well, you shall see an Arminian reaching out his hand to a papist to a Jesuit gives one hand to the Pope and the other to the King of Spain. These men have enkindled a fire in our neighbour country. Now they have brought over some of it hither, to set on flame this kingdom also.
the dread.
This fight between, like, the different sects of Christianity, it truly is, like, if you are buying into this, this is not just an existential threat, this is like spiritual warfare. So it might seem a little bit absurd from the modern perspective, where a lot of people don't take religion all that seriously. You got to think, like, if these people believe sincerely what they claim to believe, then this is not the most insane thing in the world. Though I think, from a more secular perspective, this is the most insane thing in the world.
Of sneaking Catholicism was ever present in the movement. Ultimately, Puritans' charges of papistry against political enemies became so ubiquitous and overused that the accusation lost almost all meaning, and the Pope became a more devious and detestable boogeyman than even the devil himself. Sadly, Puritan bigotry against Catholics enjoyed a centuries-long transoceanic legacy. As late as the mid-20th century, paranoia about a papist takeover of Protestant society was mainstream in the English-speaking world. While running for president in 1960, Irish Catholic John F. Kennedy had to repeatedly reassure Americans that he was not some sort of papal puppet who would make Catholicism the state religion of the United States.
Yeah, this is the mid-20th century. We ended up getting our first Catholic president. Like, that is kind of insane to some people looking back now, because being Catholic's not a big deal in the United States, really, anymore, I don't think. Catholics are all over the place, but the United States was founded in a lot of ways on like anti-Catholic sentiment. Maybe not the United States as a political entity, but people who immigrated were very often anti-Catholic. So our foundation is so anti-Catholic for like the longest time. And I'm sure that's a little bit confusing to those who don't come from predominantly Christian countries. I could see how like this falls apart like crazy. Doesn't it all come from the same place? No, it's all over the place, man.
I've stated in my judgment that there is no conflict. There is no
No.
conflict between my responsibilities as a public official,
This was
carry out
not
my
long
duties
ago.
and obligations, and my faith. Here in the United States, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Catholics, Jews, Presbyterians, Methodists, all of us happen to believe that we do not want an official state church. I would be opposed to it. If this were 99% of the population were Catholics, I would still be opposed to it. I am committed, as a matter of personal, deep conviction, to the separation. Now, what is there left to say? What could I say?
Religious
Like, we've had some presidents with complicated religious beliefs and some that were difficult to pin down. This is one case where we have somebody who's not a Protestant and openly not a Protestant and isn't really hiding what he believes. We have a lot of cases where people who are we're not 100% sure what they believe. Like Thomas Jefferson, like, he's outwardly, like, kind of a deist. Like, the sort of idea that there is a God, but he doesn't really personally care what you do. He's a little bit more hands-off, though some people have argued that Thomas Jefferson is a bit more religious than that. I don't buy that. I'd move even closer to atheism before I'd be willing to move towards him being more religious. But overall, the presidents are not super diverse in their religious beliefs as far as we know. There's plenty of people who knows, maybe they're not telling us something, but I don't think that's the case. I think we're just generally not that diverse for the longest time.
discrimination can never be defended, but it can be contextualized, and though their anti-Catholic bigotry was deplorable and xenophobic, Puritans also had legitimate ideological qualms with the Vatican, which are harder to dismiss. In the 17th century English mind, the Catholic Church represented the failing status quo. It was a profoundly unjust institution, broken beyond repair. Its power was absolute, and power had corrupted it absolutely. Christian spiritual welfare was not a concern for the See of Rome. Its only goal was the aggregation of more power and more money. And there was some truth to this view. The Church was wealthy, powerful, and active in furthering its political interests all over Europe through military force and diplomatic intrigue. To combat such a foe, Puritans would have to become politically active also. Their ultimate concern was to create a utopian Christian society, while Catholics, Anglicans, and other conservatives believed that the fall of Adam had rendered humanity inherently corrupt, creating a need for societal order through rigid hierarchies. Puritans were more optimistic. They thought that as long as people kept sincere faith and lived according to God's laws, a truly benevolent civilization was not only possible, but divinely ordained.
I don't know what that was. Are we gonna get into like Crusades or something? Because that would be moving in a weird direction.
It's hard to overstate the psychological impact of the Spanish Armada on the people of early modern
Spanish
England.
Armada. Okay, there we go.
A massive fleet dispatched by the
Wasn't
most
sure where
powerful
we were going
empire
with
the
that.
world had ever seen, sailed into the Channel intent on subjugating the country and forcing its people to practice an anathemic religion. And after a desperate fight against impossible odds, it was defeated not only by English pluck, cleverness and innovation, but by a massive providential storm, a Protestant wind that cast down the unbelievers and unequivocally demonstrated divine favour for England's cause. God and nation working together to preserve the ideals of liberty and self-determination from the forces of tyranny and corruption. The victory provided England with a powerful national narrative, one that set it apart from the Catholic-dominated continent. Unlike the French, Spanish and Italians, who languished in spiritual ignorance under the Papist heel, the English were fundamentally a free people, the true stewards of Christianity. And as such, many English thinkers began to take the ideas of the Reformation to their logical conclusions. If the Catholic Church was corrupt and power-hungry, then perhaps all churches were. Didn't Jesus himself say as much in his rebuke of the Pharisees? If the Catholic Mass was an idolatrous rite, then perhaps the Anglican one was too. Isn't idolatry of any kind expressly forbidden in God's commandments?
This water thing's making me
anxious. And if the Catholic priesthood was an elitist institution, then perhaps authority itself was inherently oppressive.
And this is a lot of the foundation for American ideology. Like it's like made in opposition to the corruption of Europe. People come over and they're like, hey, we're gonna be like good Europe. We're gonna be like Europe and have European values like before the corruption and stuff like that. Of course, we found our corruption, no doubt. But that's kind of a huge part of American ideology or identity early on, where we are like Europe, but we're a little better because we're not corrupt like the smelly Catholics. That's basically what they're trying to argue.
And God promised in Ezekiel to make the high tree low and to set the low tree on high. With this intellectual leap, the cat was out of the bag. As the 17th century dawned, numerous independent religious sects sprang up all over England, and the movement we call Puritanism began in earnest. Its cornerstone was free thought, the democratization of ideas. Scores of uneducated self-appointed preachers gathered huge ad hoc congregations in the city of London, to the horror of Anglicans and religious moderates. The invention of the printing press is often credited as the key to the Reformation's success. The Puritan movement relied on it as well, and independent sects spread their ideas through pamphlets and quartos, which were read, passionately debated upon, and vociferously responded to.
The printing press is probably one of the most important inventions to ever exist. Protestantism and how it spread literacy truly changed the world. In a lot of like early Catholicism, the ordinary person didn't really need to be able to read. Protestantism, in a lot of ways, like pushed literacy upon people because it often involved a lot of interpreting of the Bible on your own when it came to figuring out what sect you belong to.
Discourse proved immensely productive in shaping early 17th century Puritan thought, and state censorship led some, like the poet John Milton, to argue for freedom of the press in stark, unapologetic terms.
Since therefore the knowledge and survey of voice is in this world so necessary to the constituting of human virtue, and the scanning of error to the confirmation of truth, how can we more safely, and with less danger, scoot into the regions of sin and falsity than by reading all manner of tractates and hearing all manner of reason?
Distrust in authority was endemic in England. Unfortunately for just about everyone, King Charles I was a big believer in absolutism and the divine right of kings. He also had a papist wife to boot. It was too much for the Puritans. So they lopped his head off.
Yeah, tension was growing with Charles, but like it started under his father, King James, and like it kind of like all exploded under his time. But like there's a lot of tension going on like a generation earlier as well.
In 1646, Puritan pamphleteer Richard Overton wrote,
"Every man by nature is a king, priest and prophet in his own natural circuit and compass."
The English Civil War led to a revolution of ideas in the Puritan movement, and these sorts of strikingly modern, fiercely democratic sentiments were not uncommon. The Diggers' very existence was a testament to the seismic social and religious shift that convulsed England in the 1640s, and they were by no means alone in their radicalism. The most successful radical sect in this period was a group of activists who came to be known as the Levellers. More cosmopolitan and educated than the rural Diggers, the Levellers believed in universal male suffrage, the immediate abolition of the monarchy and the House of Lords, and the
This is a really good just rundown of how complicated European religion was. Like, overall, this is more than just like in defense of Puritanism. This is like a really good introduction to a lot of this stuff. If you didn't know anything about this stuff, this is fantastic.
Equality of all men before the law. Human beings
Let me just go back by 10
rural
seconds.
figures. The Levellers believed in universal male suffrage, the immediate abolition of the monarchy in the House of Lords, and equality of all men before the law. Human beings were born with God-given rights, Levellers maintained, and the role of government was to safeguard those rights. If the government ever became tyrannical or repressive, the people then had a right and a duty to rebel against it. Many parliamentarian
funky
thinkers,
helmet.
when advocating for the rights of common people, referred to themselves as freeborn subjects to the king. Early in the war, Leveller John Lilburne conspicuously abandoned this vocabulary, instead using the incendiary phrase, freeborn Englishmen. Levellers were not fighting for their liberties as coward subjects, but as citizens.
The inheritance of our fathers, and the birthright of us and our children, is our fundamental laws and liberties, franchises and privileges that God, nature, and the just customs of the land in which we live have given us.
The Levellers had faith in Parliament and representative democracy as the vehicle for their utopian mode of government, but their loyalty to the Roundhead cause was conditional. They believed that the people could revoke the power they had entrusted to elected representatives at any time and for any reason.
One of the big issues that rose up under King James and was a problem under Charles as well, clearly, is the question of, is the king above the law, or is the king held accountable by the law? And this is a question that comes and goes all the time. It just continues for like forever. This will be a question anytime any sort of absolute leader who claims divine right comes in. Like, is there any sort of thing that holds them accountable? And that was one of the big debates at the time. There was a guy in England. He was Cook, I think was his last name. Was it Charles Cook? It's spelled Coke. Either way, he was like one of the big names in the law at the time, and King James basically tried to berate him into admitting that the king was above the law, but he just wouldn't back down. He's like, no, Magna Carta very explicitly says that's not the case. It's a very interesting conversation, and clearly it didn't work out for the kings at the time.
This kind of talk frightened the Levellers' wartime allies in Parliament, and several prominent Levellers were censored and imprisoned for their views. Parliament stuck the aforementioned Richard Overton in the dock for seditious writing, and in 1646 they arrested his wife Mary for a similar offence. Whilst languishing in jail, Mary wrote a petition to Parliament, pointing out that their long imprisonment without redress violated their rights under the Magna Carta. In her closing arguments, she did not hold back.
If, for your petitioners' plainness with you, and just desires for redress of our most insufferable grievances, you shall be provoked to exercise further cruelty and affliction, either upon herself or her husband, it will be a certain confirmation to all that shall hear of it, which shall be the whole kingdom, if your petitioner's husband miss not of his aim, that you are absolutely resolved, if possibly you can, to enslave the common people of England to a lordly arbitrary vassalage and bondage, to conquer and destroy their laws, rights, liberties and freedoms, and to turn co-usurpers and joint tyrants with that Norman broad, insolent, domineering tyrants and usurpers, the House of Lords.
You can hear a lot of, though it's a little different, you can hear a lot of the revolutionary language that would be coming, like getting close to the turn of the 19th century, and we're so far removed from that. But you can see where a lot of the foundations are.
Leveller invective against parliamentary abuses of power did not end there, and in the spring and summer of 1647, the alliance between Puritan radicals and moderate parliamentarians finally broke down. In the Leveller view, Parliament had abused its power and broken its trust with the people, thereby forfeiting its claim to civil authority. So the Levellers and their associates found new allies in the new model army, at the time a hotbed of democratic radicalism. In many ways, it was a marriage of convenience. In the lull between the First and the Second Civil Wars, the army was the only morally uncompromised administrative body left in England. In June of 1647, it had seized the captive King Charles from parliamentary custody, firmly establishing itself as a radical political force independent of Oliver Cromwell's regime. Civilian and military radicals did not agree on everything, but they could make common cause against Cromwell and the landed gentry of Parliament. Though an MP himself, Colonel Thomas Rainsborough spoke for many in the army when he said,
"We would fair know what the soldier hath fought for all this while. He hath fought to enslave himself, to give poor to men of riches, men of estates, to make him a perpetual slave."
That autumn, the army drafted a document called An Agreement of the People, proposing a drastic egalitarian remaking of English society, and presented it to Parliament. Though primarily a list of army demands, the agreement prominently showcased several leveller ideas about suffrage, government of the people, and lower class liberation. Moderates and radicals famously argued over the merit of the agreement in a series of debates at army headquarters in Putney. Speaking to Cromwell's son-in-law Henry Ireton, Rainsborough summarised the radical position in powerful terms.
"I do not find anything in the law of God, that a lord should choose 20 burgesses and a gentleman but 2, or a poor man shall choose none. I am a poor man, therefore I must be pressed. If we have no property in the kingdom, we must suffer by all their laws, be they right or wrong. Gentlemen with 3 or 4 lordships, God knows how they got them, can always get into Parliament and evict the poor from their homes. I would fain know whether the potency of rich men do not this, and so keep the poor under the greatest tyranny that was ever thought of in the world. Really, I think the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he, and therefore, truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first, by his own consent, to put himself under that government. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound in a strict sense to that government that he hath not had a voice to put himself under."
It really is ahead of its time. I'm really enjoying this one.
The escape of King Charles from army custody abruptly ended the Putney debates, and soon England was plunged into another bloody civil war. Cromwell sowed division amongst the radicals, who fragmented into squabbling factions. By 1650, the Levellers were effectively neutralised as a political force. Cromwell's Commonwealth proved to be just as dictatorial, arbitrary and repressive as the monarchy had been, with disastrous consequences for the people of the British Isles, especially Ireland. Cromwell's death left the regime rudderless, and in 1660 the monarchy was restored with the coronation of Charles II.
So at this point, a large amount of Puritans have been flocking to America by the time Charles is gone. So I'm curious if this is going to be entirely European. We're only 20 minutes in, so it's interesting. But they mentioned like the witch hunts and stuff. I assume we're gonna have to get into at least like the Massachusetts Puritans. That's absolutely one of like the big things that people think of when they think of the Puritans in the United States. You gotta get into the Massachusetts Puritans. So I'm hoping we get to that, because that is
progressive Puritanism had reached its high water mark with the Levellers and army radicals making their case at Putney. For one brief, tantalising moment, democratic egalitarianism nearly broke into the political mainstream, hundreds of years ahead of schedule. Instead, the movement faltered, and all the work of men and women like Richard and Mary Overton, Gerard Winstanley, John Lilburn, John Milton, and countless others came to naught. The sun had set on Puritan England, but the movement still retained one last foothold at the edge of the wilderness on a far distant shore.
He's really playing with these filters. He's having a ball with these. Art tattoo. Yes! Yeah! America! Yep. This is it.
In the 1630s, English Puritans emigrated to America by the thousands. They built their first villages on land belonging to the Wampanoag and Massachusetts nations, in a region that had been known from time immemorial as the Dawnland.
So this is around where I live. The Wampanoag from pretty much around here. The Massachusetts and Rhode Island are kind of like hand in hand in a lot of ways in our early history. Like, there are parallels between the two, and like the direct connections, like the Roger Williams one that I mentioned earlier in the video, where they banish a guy and he goes off and founds the neighboring state.
Barely 20 years earlier, an epidemic had devastated these native nations
Colony,
and
sorry,
severely
not a state for a
depopulated
while.
Dawnland's Atlantic coasts, leaving them wide open for English settlement. In Dawnland, which the new arrivals quickly rechristened as New England, the Puritan movement had a unique opportunity to build their ideal society. A city upon a hill, in the famous words of Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop. But they quickly discovered that it had been much easier to agitate against an unjust system in England than it was to create an entirely new one.
Hold on. John Winthrop. Familiar name? Familiar name, everybody? I've mentioned him pretty recently. John Winthrop is the guy from my most recent YouTube short. If you, and because I've been studying this for hopefully a video, maybe a paper. I don't know exactly where it's going. Oh, Atinshe's from Massachusetts. That would make sense why he'd be interested in this stuff. So I'm going to just play this real quick because this is John Winthrop. I just find it amusing, and if you guys haven't seen this, I want you to see it. Hold on, let me disappear for a second so it's like you're watching just a video of me. There we go.
The following is based on true feelings of confusion that I had while researching another video. Good evening, John Winthrop, Governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I just wanted to ask you a couple questions about some of the stuff I read in your journal. Where did you find my journal? You see, you write that Christ had married you to himself? Well, it's the romantic style. It was normal at the time. Then you go on to say, I was so ravished with his love towards me, far exceeding the affection of the kindest husband. Well, it's a metaphor, you see. I was trying to... Oh, my Lord, my love, how wholly delectable thou art. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for his love is sweeter than wine. It seems like you really love Christ. I mean, you love Christ, you're in love with Christ? Like, what the heck is this? I have no beef with you, sir. I'm just trying to figure out where this is coming from.
Okay, I'm done. Sorry about that. Oh, wrong thing. There's me. Yeah, that guy. I love learning about him right now, because he was a true believer. He's the guy who made the statement that that the Puritans over there would build a city upon a hill. And that statement really exemplifies what I mean when I say that people who came to America wanted to be like Europe, but better. Sorry. Failed transition there. Like Europe, but better. We wanted to have what they had, but we really wanted to do it without the corruption, and we wanted to be like this pure Protestant haven where the world could be free of the problems of Europe. So he's a fascinating figure and definitely worth learning about.
America.
Gonna go back.
Discovered that it had been much easier to agitate against an unjust system in England than it was to create an entirely new one in America. Puritans founded 4 major lasting colonies in New England: Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Rhode Island.
So, Rhode Island, here's where I am, and it's going to be carved out a little better. When Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts Bay. He had to cross over here. He met up with the Native Americans, and now I live here.
The movement would manifest itself differently in each colony over time, but in the interests of brevity, this video will focus primarily on Massachusetts, the most populous of the four. Puritan Massachusetts has a bad reputation. Most of us think of it as a brutally repressive fundamentalist theocracy. There is some truth to this. Catholics, Africans, and Native Americans, for instance, were actively discriminated against from the colony's inception. But it's worth noting that Puritan Massachusetts was never theocratic, nor did it aspire to be. Though civic and religious life was closely intertwined, elected secular officials, not clerical elites, held the most power within society. And among the citizenry, white Protestants enjoyed a level of self-determination in America that their relatives in England could scarcely dream of. Citizens of the Commonwealth exercised their civic rights in town meetings, which remain a fixture of Massachusetts politics to this day. The custom began as an outgrowth of Congregationalism and evolved into a powerful form of localized, direct democracy. The distribution of land in newfound settlements among English males of all classes has been hailed as a socio-economic revolution. Settler Peter Noyes, for instance, had come from a village in England where half the inhabitants were landless serfs, and the other half feudal tenants to the local lord. Under the charter of his new home, the town of Sudbury, Massachusetts, which is, incidentally, the hometown of the person who made this video, every adult male had the opportunity for a grant of land ownership, along with all its attendant privileges. It was...
Oh, Neron, we're not going to escape racism if we're talking about American history. It's just not going to go anywhere here. We're still working on that right now, so, like, it's a reality, man.
Wasn't quite the godly utopia Gerard Winstanley envisioned, but he certainly would have felt more at home in Sudbury than in Weybridge. In matters of the spirit, colonists broadly agreed that their new society should foster the precepts of Puritanism, but the movement's lack of formal organization and tendency towards anti-authoritarianism guaranteed that disagreements would arise about how to best accomplish this. Establishing a religious orthodoxy would help shield the Commonwealth from the malicious influence of popery and heresy.
Popery, you're going to hear that a lot.
Would stifle free thought, which seemed like a betrayal of the very soul of the movement. Governor Winthrop took the more liberal view, supporting the rights of colonists to discuss and differ on the fine points of Puritan theology.
Yeah, Winthrop's all right, because I've talked about how Roger Williams was banished. He was forced to leave because he had more liberal views on religion. He didn't like the idea of forced worship. I think it's like the statement was like, forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. And he, in a sense, wanted people to come around to religion on their own, and that would mean you'd have to have religious freedom. He ends up getting banished, and John Winthrop, I believe, sent word to him that he was going to be arrested. So, homie helped him out a little.
Winthrop was keenly aware of his own fallibility and regarded civic authority as too changeable and too subject to human passions to dictate a strict religious canon in accordance with God's will. Others, like Thomas Dudley, another early Massachusetts governor, were not as self-reflective. Dudley was keen to define the limits of Puritan orthodoxy, to establish an intellectual parameter around righteous belief and behaviour, not unlike the sprawling English cowpens that were then springing up all around Massachusetts, to the chagrin of local Native Americans. Dudley probably considered Winthrop's hand-wringing to be absurd and ineffectual. When he peered beyond the bounds of English plantations, he saw a howling wilderness full of spiritual dangers. The colonies were hemmed in on all wilderness. When he peered beyond the bounds of English plantations, he saw a howling wilderness.
Sorry, that's just beautiful. I gotta take my camera out into the woods more often. We still have so much wonderful space like this. That's one great thing about the United States. Even a lot of our dense places, there's still so much natural beauty to it with how young we are as a place. Well, as an organized country.
full of spiritual dangers. The colonies were hemmed in on all sides by heathen Indians, Canadian Papists, and Rhode Island Quakers, all of whom would happily tempt the godly people of Massachusetts into sin and unbelief, given half a chance. The colonial government would need to take swift, decisive action against these evildoers if their commonwealth was to survive. Most early émigrés agreed with Winthrop, placing their faith in human reason and in God. Heretical ideas, they reckoned, were no match for the power of Christian truth. But this philosophy of tolerance was soon put under severe strain by two major religious controversies in Massachusetts: the Free Grace debate of the 1630s and the Halfway Covenant dispute of the 1660s. Both were sparked by minor dogmatic differences that would mean very little to anyone who isn't a 17th century Puritan. But within the movement, disagreements were profound, and many of these new ideas were deemed too dangerous for the colony to abide. Dissidents were disenfranchised, banished, or even executed. Spooked, the clergy began to lose faith in tolerance and gravitate towards Dudley's camp. Like many other progressive movements of history, New England Puritans often attacked dissenters within their own ranks more than their overarching common enemy. And towards the end of his life, Dudley lamented that
"We hated and do hate every false way in religion, not only the old idolatry and superstition of paupery which is wearing away, but much more, and being much worse, the new heresies, blasphemies, and errors of late, which are secretly received and fostered here more than we wish they were."
As the first generation of colonists gave way to a second, the colonies became
Yeah, Anne Hutchinson. Yeah, Michael Hill. Anne Hutchinson is another case similar to the Roger Williams one. It's a little less ingrained in my local education, but we learn about Anne Hutchinson all the time. She had a very similar case of not fully conforming to the Puritans. So we start getting into some of the uglier behavior in the United States, I'd imagine, because so far the Puritans haven't seemed too bad. One problem with like the in defense of thing, if you just highlight the things that are favorable to them, people will think you're biased, but he seems like he's had an okay balance so far. So I've enjoyed that.
Perceptibly more stratified as American Puritanism began to institutionalize. The gulf widened between true saints, those whose salvation was assured, and mere professors of Christianity, those still struggling to achieve a union with God. Clergymen started demanding more conformity from their congregations, and the qualifications for church membership became more stringent. Church membership was an integral part of life in Puritan Massachusetts. To obtain it, colonists had to provide their congregation with evidence that they had sincerely experienced a divine personal revelation. Only truly godly people were to be granted membership, which bestowed social and legal privileges as well as spiritual ones. For instance, only full church members could vote or hold town office. It may be that church members were selected for reasons that were less than divine. By some strange coincidence, God's elect tended to be wealthy landowners born of good families who concurred with established religious orthodoxy. The new generation, which came of age in the 1650s and 60s, was less committed to church and community than their parents had been. In 1643, 78% of the population had been church members. By 1678, membership had fallen to 47%. To make matters worse, during these years, Massachusetts saw an influx of non-Puritan immigrants looking for work in merchant towns like Boston, Salem, and Ipswich, which were quickly burgeoning into important centers of Atlantic commerce. The city, on a hill, was being poisoned from within, its purity diluted by the people's disobedience to God. So God punished them.
Okay, I was expecting this to get frantic. Oh, are we gonna be talking about the witch trials? Wait, is this too early for that? What year are we on? Oh, never mind. This is something else. We weren't there yet.
During the first half-century of New England's existence, English settlers and Native Americans lived side by side. The boundaries between these people, as cultures, communities, and polities, were porous, not well defined. By 1675, the region was a patchwork landscape of two radically different ways of life. English villages, cattle farms, and oat plantations abutted native maize fields, pear tree orchards, and hunting grounds. Clusters of wigwams were often found within walking distance of congregational meeting houses. But despite their close proximity, colonists demonstrated a near-complete lack of curiosity about their strange neighbors. The colonists considered themselves...
That is so interesting, seeing that from them being so close to where I'm from. Where we're from, well, where I'm from, where this guy's from, we had a very different relationship with the natives, and it's gonna get complicated once King Philip's War goes down, which is too big of a conversation to get into too much right now. But our founding comes from cooperation with the natives. They were the first ones to help Roger Williams when he was banished. He actually ended up learning their languages. He ended up writing a book about their languages, which is really, really interesting. And that's why I actually love talking about him as a founder, because like people during this time, you don't find a lot of people who were so so modern thinking about that stuff, I guess.
Progenitors of a utopia. Their movement was righteous, its mission divinely ordained.
I love his color palette.
And what could God's chosen people
Not many colors
possibly
in it.
have to learn from a nation of half-naked heathens? The Puritan movement had defined itself by its struggles against the status quo, and in America, it established a new status quo based on godly Protestantism and egalitarian ideals. But these ideals were never meant to apply to everyone, which became painfully apparent in the colony's legal treatment of the non-white population, and particularly of Native Americans.
Oh, he has a video on King Philip's War? Dude! Like, we're gonna have to do that one. Not this time. Not this time. Well, only one Atunche video per stream. But yes, of course he would have one if he's from Massachusetts. That makes sense. I knew I liked this guy.
Americans. The Puritans considered America theirs, to do with as they pleased. They had a very clear idea of what their ideal society should look like, and it did not include indigenous people. For most colonists, Native Americans were simply an obstacle to be removed, most often through larcenous land sales, which were only binding under a legal system the natives were not beholden to, and utilized a cogitation of private property that had no equivalent concept in Algonquin culture.
And it's interesting, at first they didn't even want to buy the land. That was one of the big beefs that they had with Roger Williams. He's like, we should, if we're taking this land, we should at least pay them for it in some way. But they didn't even want to do that at first. But then once we start buying land, a lot of these deals are just such BS that the Native Americans only serve to lose from it.
But again, Puritans were not a monolith. A sizable minority in Massachusetts, most notably clergyman John Eliot and magistrate Daniel Gookin, recognized the humanity of Native Americans and took it upon themselves to attempt to convert the people of Dawnland to godly Christianity. And many natives were receptive to conversion. These praying Indians, as they were soon known, adopted English customs. They wore English clothing and lived in segregated English-built towns. A few even became proficient missionaries in their own right, like John Sassamon, the protege of John Eliot. Originally of Wampanoag extraction, Sassamon had thoroughly assimilated into English colonial society. He was a committed evangelical Puritan with a Harvard education, and in the early 1670s was actively engaged in mediating the increasingly acrimonious dispute between Plymouth Colony and Metacomet, sachem of the Pokanoket, the leader of the Wampanoag.
Yeah, Metacomet, it was kind of like a point of honor for him to receive an English name as well. Like his name was Metacomet, but he received the name King Philip. That wasn't just the West, not the West, sorry. I want to say Americans, not even that. This isn't just the the settlers coming in and being like, yeah, we don't want to call them Metacomet. No, that was actually, like, I believe, a point of honor to receive that name, to have this other name.
Wampanoag Confederacy. When a group of English settlers founded the town of Swansea less than 10 miles from Metacomet's ancestral seat of Mount Hope, the sachem protested to Plymouth that his lands were being illegally occupied. Eliot sent Sassamon and 2 other native ministers to negotiate with Metacomet, eventually persuading him to seek redress with neutral parties from the governments of Massachusetts and Connecticut. Unsurprisingly, these arbitrators sided with the Swansea settlers and forced Metacomet to face humiliating legal ramifications. They demanded he swear fealty to the King of England, pay a heavy fine, and surrender all of his nation's firearms. Over the next few years, tensions between Plymouth and the Wampanoag increased. By the winter of 1675, Sassamon became convinced that Metacomet was preparing to declare war on the English, and said as much to Plymouth Governor Josiah Winslow. Winslow ignored the warning. The governor was not fond of Indians, even Christianized ones, and had little faith in their intelligence. A few weeks later, Sassamon was found dead beneath the ice of a pond in the woods of southeastern Massachusetts. The English immediately suspected foul play, and Plymouth authorities arrested 3 Wampanoag warriors for murder. Based upon the testimony of a single witness, a jury of 12 Englishmen and 6 praying Indians found the defendants guilty, and they were subsequently hanged. From the Puritan perspective, justice had been done fairly, with all due consideration to the native parties concerned. A native man's murder was avenged, and a biracial jury had passed down the conviction. But what the magistrates of Plymouth had failed to appreciate was the basic fact of Wampanoag autonomy. The natives were not citizens of the colonies, nor were they subject to colonial laws. They were the independent people of an ancient sovereign nation. So, in June 1675, Pokanoket warriors burned Swansea to the ground and murdered its inhabitants, marking the beginning of King Philip's War, the bloodiest and most devastating conflict in the history of New England, which would end in the virtual extermination of 3 native nations, the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, and the Narragansett.
And we will check out Atun Shea's video on it, because I would love to talk about that. I don't know when, but we will do it.
Extraordinary life and tragic death of John Sassamon demonstrates the limits of Puritan egalitarianism. The man was a more dedicated Puritan than most English colonists of his generation, but nonetheless, when he came to Winslow to alert him of a dire threat, the governor had haughtily waved him away. Clearly, despite Sassamon's bone-deep commitment to Christianity and the European way of life, he was never fully accepted into New England society. The war, which claimed the lives of a horrifying number of English civilians, only served to intensify Puritan racism. At the start of hostilities, a tiny number of praying Indians apostatized and defected to Metacomet, and this led to a general paranoia that all Christian natives were colluding with the enemy, and intense persecutions followed. Soldiers, in particular the notorious company of Captain Samuel Mosley, regularly committed atrocities against non-combatant praying Indians whose only crime was being Native American. And these English abuses were only prosecuted during the war on one occasion in August of 1676, when 4 soldiers murdered a group of native women and children near Concord. The soldiers were arrested, convicted of murder, and put to death. Incredibly, the execution sparked a major public outcry. The war had been so traumatizing, and New Englanders had become so callously bigoted that news of the execution of child murderers was a cause for outrage. That same month, the war was effectively ended with Metacomet's murder at the hands of a native soldier in the Plymouth militia. Natives who were proved to have shed English blood were executed or sold into slavery in the Caribbean by the thousands.
Yeah, the enslaving of natives is a messy topic, because, like, they kind of go back and forth on whether or not that's okay to do. They pretty quickly determine, okay, Africans, you can totally enslave them. With Native Americans, they had a little bit of gray area where some people were just not sure if it was ethical to do that. And we're messing with, like, really, really all over the place ethics that are really hard to put, like, a modern brain into. But at this point, it's not fully been phased out. Eventually, they're just not really going to be enslaving natives all that much. Somewhere along the line, they determined, nope, just Africans. For some reason, that's fine, but, like, let's not go beyond that line.
Though natives who had supported the English were ostensibly allowed to remain in the colony and go about their lives, Puritans remained deeply suspicious of preying Indians, and many began openly wondering what was to be done with them. Before the war, Edmund Brown, First Minister of Sudbury, had enjoyed long and fruitful friendships with several local Native Americans. But in this 1677 letter to the magistrates of Middlesex County, Brown advocated for the institution of shockingly oppressive policies to control the preying Indian population.
We assert that as to the generality of those called preying Indians, we have found them to be very false, whatever they pretend. If, sir, you desire me advice, we can say our wisdom lieth in first a diminishing of the enemy's number, second in assigning some to a convenient place or places for them and us, third in confining of them to some circumference beyond which without an English guard not to pass upon parallel life, fourth a disarming them of their European ammunition, that by these means they may be kept necessarily dependent on the English, without which we know not how we can be assured.
King Philip's War saw the Puritan utopian ideal come into sharp conflict with the brutal realities of the 17th century world. The clergy insisted that the war had been God's punishment for the sin and deviancy of the colony's second generation. But in truth, the English had been so blithe and arrogant in their dealings with the Wampanoag that honor had compelled Metacomet to violence. It's hard to reconcile the radical libertarian sentiments of progressive Puritanism with the eventual fate of the movement in America. The war demonstrated that this utopian society was still subject to the vagaries of human nature. The city on a hill had faced an existential threat, and from its moment of crisis gave itself over to fear, hatred, and bigotry. The Puritan movement may not have died on the battlefields of King Philip's War, but it was mortally wounded, permanently compromised. And it would limp on for another generation before finally, blessedly, giving up its ghost.
And for a while, Puritanism's still going to be, like, thrown around as a concept, and people are definitely going to be compared to them a whole lot throughout history. But yeah, we've hit kind of the peak for them. Like, people are being compared not so favorably to Puritans through, like, the American independence period and all that. Like, it's a thing. Dude, I have no idea what's going on with these effects anymore. They're very... Is he on something?
Puritan colonists believed
is this
that
what
the North
Molly
American
is like?
continent was the domain of Satan, who was actively working through unseen supernatural means to thwart the New England experiment. Massachusetts was the front line of a spiritual war between the forces of light and those of darkness, and its people were chosen by God to fight the devil in his name. When settlers witnessed a mouse kill a snake in Watertown, Massachusetts, clergyman John Wilson interpreted it as a sign of God's favour in this cosmic struggle.
The snake was the devil, the mouse was a poor contemptible people which God hath brought hither to New England, which should overcome Satan here and dispossess him of his kingdom.
There was a sort of cultural continuity to this abiding fear, this clear demarcation between godly settlements and satanic wildernesses. Most colonists hailed from East Anglia, a gloomy, misty part of England characterised by fens and marshes. These wild places loom large in East Anglian folklore as the nightmarish domain of boggarts, ghosts, sea hags, and witches. During King Philip's
During this time, people will, like, straight up claim to see the devil just kind of hanging out. And they're not crazy for saying it, apparently. People will be like, well, of course, she saw the devil. What do you think?
War, Puritans had learned
That's the brains
that the
we got to get
monsters
into
lurking
here.
within the wildernesses of North America were all too human. The war had been highly unconventional by European standards. Warriors had moved undetected through the woods and swamps between English settlements, emerging without warning to destroy a plantation or smash a company of militia before melting back into the countryside. Hostile natives could be anywhere and everywhere. They seemed unstoppable. The frontier shrank until even Boston was under serious threat of attack. The war was going so badly that in the spring of 1676, the future of the colonies was genuinely in doubt. Most New Englanders interpreted these bloody 14 months as a cold spiritual war going hot. For half a century, the godly had hewn a righteous commonwealth out from the wilderness. Now the wilderness was striking back. God had allowed Satan, working through his instrument, Metacomet, to try his best to wipe the city on a hill from the face of the earth. The forces of darkness had nearly triumphed.
Just hanging out.
But at the 11th hour, God had delivered his chosen people from destruction. King Charles II took a more prosaic view of the situation. His father had, of course, been decapitated by revolutionary Puritans, and New England even sheltered a few fugitive regicides who had fled across the Atlantic after the Restoration. The king...
So he's just like, oh, they had it coming. They've had this coming for a while.
Couldn't care less about the New Englanders' utopian experiment. He looked at the godly Commonwealth and saw only a handful of insolently independent, unproductive colonies. Not unfairly, he saw the disaster of King Philip's War as a failure of Puritan colonial leadership. A change of administration was clearly sorely needed. So the Crown began steadily exerting more control over its wayward American subjects, culminating in the establishment of the Dominion of New England in 1686, which placed English colonial holdings from New Jersey to Maine under the control of a single governor.
If they are talking about the witch hunts here, then he probably could just go to Salem to film this, right? If he's from Massachusetts. He could, like... And Salem is amazing. You gotta go. Like, you gotta go during the Halloween season. They have so many amazing events. It's incredible. It is like a yearly must. You gotta go if you get the chance to. I know a lot of you aren't from the United States, but yeah. Oh, hey, DJ Megaim is in the Chizat. Hey, man. If y'all don't know, I occasionally appear on his channel where we do, we've done a couple live streams with him and his friends on there. So, like, glad to have him there. Dream Master, I've been going for almost 4 hours at this point. Almost. Though I've taken breaks, so closer to 3. Alright, let's continue.
Trouble only to the king. Puritans chafed under the new regime. Thankfully, it was short-lived. In the glorious revolution of 1688, William of Orange overthrew the Catholic king James II, re-establishing Protestant rule in England. As soon as the news reached North America the following spring, Puritans in Boston revolted against the Dominion, imprisoned the governor and his officials.
He has another video on him visiting Salem and his Witchfinder General. Okay, maybe I should go back and check out his Witchfinder General thing before I move any further with this, because I don't understand this character. I don't know what it is, and I need to know.
And seized back control of the colonies. The day of the uprising, a group of prominent Bostonians drafted a declaration, airing their grievances and justifying their actions.
Our governor used his power, with the advice and consent of his council, to make laws and raise taxes as he pleased, and several companies or redcoats were now brought from Europe to support what was to be imposed upon us. It was a maxim delivered in open court unto us by one of the council, that we must not think the privileges of Englishmen would follow us to the end of the world. Accordingly, we have been treated with multiplied contradictions to Magna Carta, the rights of which we laid claim unto. Persons who did but passively object against the raising of taxes without an assembly have been for it fined, some 20, some 30, and others £50. Packed and picked juries have been very common things among us. Without a verdict, Yea, without a jury sometimes have people been fined most unrighteously, and some not of the meanest quality have been kept in long and close imprisonment, without any the least information appearing against them, or an habeas corpus allowed unto them.
Echoing the sentiments of radical pamphlets during the Civil War, the rebels claimed that the Dominion had violated their rights as Englishmen. It was a powerful statement of self-determination, and New Englanders would stave off direct crown rule for another 80 years. They were powerless, however, against the trend of increasing cosmopolitanism in the colonial world. North America was no longer a mysterious, unexplored continent of far-flung European settlements. It was an organised, populous, and complex socio-economic network of competing colonial powers, monopolistic mercantile corporations, and increasingly centralised native super-confederacies. Simply put, the Atlantic world was getting smaller, and as a cog in the machine of global politics, the city on a hill could not survive. But the ancient East Anglian fear of the wilderness still remained in the Puritan psyche, and it would fuel the movement's last gasp of cultural relevance before it disappeared forever.
Excuse me?
Before it disappeared forever.
It's just... What a choice of sound effect for, like, an incredible dramatic build-up. Where'd you get that from? Team 4-Star? Oh, that's pretty metal, man.
In the winter of 1692, 2 little girls in Salem were seized by strange fits of mania. They claimed a local woman was appearing to them in a spectral form, continually tormenting them and demanding they put their names in the devil's book. Doctors were called in, then clergymen and magistrates, who determined that a coven of witches had infiltrated Salem. The ensuing investigation would result...
And this is one of the most famous cases of what is called mass hysteria. The question as to whether or not the question as to whether or not it started as hysteria or if it started with a lie is hard to determine because you can't really put yourself in somebody's brain like that. I don't know, like, somebody could serve to benefit from particular people being called out as witches, but I'd imagine it's a mix of people who are genuine believers and some people who are cynical.
In the execution of 20 people for witchcraft. Those who saw the devil described him as a black man dressed like an Indian, as well they might. During King Philip's War, flocks of traumatised refugees from the smoking frontier had fled to Salem, and many were still there in 1692. In many ways, the hysteria of the witch trials was a fitting way for the Puritan movement to collapse. Orthodoxy had led to intolerance, intolerance fostered paranoia, and paranoia exploded into a frenzied bloodletting which would stain Puritanism's reputation forever. But such pleasing narratives do not often reflect historical realities, and not everyone involved in the witch trials had abandoned the progressive Puritan ideas of free thought, reason, and fairness under the law. I'll say it again, shall I? Puritans were not a monolith. The witch trials occurred decades after the practice of witch hunting had waned in Europe, and many at the time viewed it as an outrageous miscarriage of justice. Especially controversial was the court's admission of spectral evidence, essentially witness testimony that a witch's spirit had appeared to their victim. Puritans were divided on the issue of spectral evidence. In the midst of the trials, Increase Mather, Boston's leading theologian, strongly denounced it.
Increase Mather. He must be related to Cotton Mather, right? I don't know his family tree very well, but there's a guy who's a very influential dude in Massachusetts called Cotton Mather. He might be related to him. I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Increase Mather, Boston's leading theologian, strongly denounced it.
This they now declare and testify, that to take away the life of anyone, merely because a spectre or devil in a bewitched or possessed person does accuse them, will bring the guilt of innocent blood on the land, where such a thing shall be done. Mercy forbid that it should, and I trust that as it has not, it never will be so in New England. This notwithstanding, I will add, it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape, than that one innocent person should be condemned.
However,
And that's like a very common legal principle that is just like blown up into insanity because you're talking about literal witches. But the idea that you would rather let the guilty walk free than have the free found guilty. That's a very common legal principle. It's just being applied in an insane way. Okay, Cotton Mather was Increase Mather's son. Thank you, Michael Hill. I wasn't sure because, like, I think the relevancy of that family is at its peak with Cotton Mather, so I would know him and everything that comes after more likely than I would know what came before him.
Suspected witches should escape, then that one innocent person should be condemned.
However, his son, the
That makes
equally
sense.
famous clergyman and polymath Cotton Mather,
Hey,
reckoned
there
that
he
as
is. I
far
just
as
had to wait.
witches were concerned, it was better to be safe than sorry. On August 19th, 1692, Cotton presided over the hangings of 5 convicted witches in Salem. Among the
That's
condemned
insane.
was one George Burroughs, the minister of a church in Wells, Maine. With the rope around his neck, Burroughs addressed the crowd assembled around the scaffold, insisting on his innocence. He then successfully recited the Lord's Prayer in its entirety, which demonologists had long maintained.
Let me just say this for anybody who's come in since the beginning. If you're, I don't know if you got the warning at the beginning. If you're like sensitive to lights or whatever, this video is not for you. I know we're in like the last 10 minutes, but this was standing out to me a bit. This little flash there, and I think it should be pointed out every once in a while. I should have pointed it out more.
Witches could never do. The crowd was stunned. Many were in tears, and for a moment it seemed like the executions would be halted. But Cotton Mather, mounted on a horse, declared that the devil was speaking through Burroughs.
A monster.
Satan, he reminded the crowd, often appeared as an angel of light. Burroughs was promptly hanged. His body was dragged by the noose into a shallow grave, and so sloppily covered with dirt that his hand, foot, and chin were left uncovered. Cotton's lack of compassion would come back to haunt him. In the aftermath of the trials, a Bostonian cloth merchant named Robert Califf compiled a number of eyewitness testimonies from people involved in the trials, as well as the families of its victims. He published the compilation, along with his own biting commentary, in the book More Wonders of the Invisible World. The book denounced the magistrates and clergymen responsible for the executions at Salem, attacking Cotton Mather in particular, whose reputation never recovered. Using reasoned common-sense arguments, Califf demonstrated that the trials were of dubious legality and dismissed.
But Cotton Mather is still kind of respected for generations. He's still considered one of the great theologians of his time, which is kind of crazy that this didn't completely destroy him as far as history is concerned.
The Puritan belief in witchcraft as more informed by contemporary superstition than by scriptural evidence. Within 5 years, the people of Massachusetts regarded the witch trials as an atrocious embarrassment. In 1696, the jurors who had found the accused witches guilty even offered a public apology.
Whose names are underwritten, being in the year 1692 called to serve as jurors in court at Salem on trial and many, who were by some suspected guilty of doing acts of witchcraft upon the bodies of sundry persons. We confess that we were, for want of knowledge in ourselves, and better information from others, prevailed with to take up with such evidence against the accused, that on further consideration and better information, we justly fair was insufficient. We do therefore hereby signify to all in general, and to the surviving sufferers in especial, our deep sense of and sorrow for our errors, in acting on such evidence to the condemning of any person, and hereby declare that we justly fear that we were sadly deluded and mistaken, for which we are much disquieted and distressed in our minds, and therefore humbly beg forgiveness.
They admitted they were wrong.
The public's
That's
faith in
insane.
Puritanism and made
We don't
prominent
do that
Puritan
here.
clergymen like the Mathers look foolish and capricious. As New England became more diverse and cosmopolitan, it began to lose its unique identity as a godly commonwealth and drifted inexorably into the political orbit of the emerging British
Kinda
Empire.
terrifying.
By the dawn of the 18th century, the Puritan movement was effectively finished.
Epilogue. Okay. Oh, it's today. Cool. Beautiful. It's your boy. Oh, so this was made during
Benjamin
the pandemic.
Franklin was born in Boston in 1706, as the third and final generation of New England Puritans was starting to die off. When he was 15 years old, his brother James started a newspaper, the New England Courant. Young Benjamin, quite the budding scribbler,
This is not a story that I was expecting to make its way into this video, but I know where he's going with this one.
tried repeatedly to get his work published in it, but James refused him at every turn. So Benjamin invented an alter ego, the middle-aged widow Silence Dogood, who wrote opinion pieces that Benjamin slipped under the door of James's printing shop. The often humorous editorials commented on current events in and around Boston, and Dogood minced no words in her critiques of the wealthy and powerful. Through Dogood, Ben Franklin addressed such weighty issues as freedom of speech and the consent of the governed, familiar territory to the progressive Puritan agitators of the last century. But Franklin approached these subjects with one key difference. Whereas Puritans thought of egalitarianism and freedom in the context of godly Christianity, Franklin rejected religion almost entirely. In one Silence Dogood letter, he went so far as to say that religious zeal actually inhibited good government.
It has been for some time a question with me whether a commonwealth suffers more by hypocritical pretenders to religion or by the openly profane, but some late thoughts of this nature.
I think those shots are being done in Boston. He's talking about Benjamin Franklin, which he's known for being from Philadelphia, like it's stated in the chat. But the thing is that during this period, he was from Boston. He is a Bostonian by birth, but not a he's not always associated with it in hindsight. I guess he's more associated with Philadelphia, which is weird. It feels like, to me, he's a Bostonian living in Philadelphia for most of his life. That's how I see it.
Have inclined me to think that the hypocrite is the most dangerous person of the two, especially if he sustains a post in the government. A public hypocrite every day deceives his betters, and makes them the ignorant trumpeters of his supposed godliness. They take him for a saint, and pass him for one, without considering that they are, as it were, the instruments of public mischief out of conscience, and ruin their country for God's sake.
Franklin was a pioneer in this sense. In the 18th century, the democratic ideals of Puritanism went mainstream, but they were thoroughly decoupled from their religious contexts. Thomas Jefferson famously declared that human equality was self-evident, and that God and...
Okay, the guys, we're saying that one shot in the plaza was at Liberty Hall. That's what Hildebrand's saying in the chat. Okay.
endowed individuals with inalienable rights under the law. The language of much of the Declaration of Independence would have been very familiar to the Putney Radicals, or to the Bostonians who overthrew the Dominion of New England. But Jefferson was by no means a godly man. He wasn't even a practicing Christian. He admired the teachings of Jesus, but denied his divinity, and regarded...
Yeah, have you seen Thomas Jefferson's Bible? Look it up. It's this big. He made his own Bible where he took out all the miracles and just kept in, like, the teachings of Jesus. Like, this big. So that's Thomas Jefferson. I've argued that he might be an atheist.
regarded the Bible as a collection of fictional mythological tales.
But most people think that he's a deist. So let's just say that, I suppose. That's the popular belief. My belief is he's an atheist.
Jefferson believed in God, but loathed organized religion, and fiercely opposed its intrusion into secular government. In the seminal text, Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson blasted religious intolerance and argued that personal belief can never be ethically legislated.
Why, Virginia's Act of Assembly of...
Independence Hall, not Liberty Hall. Hildebrand wanted to clarify.
1805. If a person brought up in the Christian religion denies the being of a god, or the Trinity, or asserts there are more gods than one, or denies the Christian religion to be true, or the scriptures to be of divine authority, he is punishable on the first offence by incapacity to hold any office or employment ecclesiastical, civil, or military. On the second, by disability to sue, to take any gift or legacy, to be guardian, executor, or administrator, and by 3 years imprisonment, without bail. But our rulers can have authority over such natural rights only as we have submitted to them. The rights of conscience we never submitted. We could not submit. We are answerable for them only to our God. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbour to say there are 20 gods, or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg.
Neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. That's a phrase that is often attributed to Benjamin Franklin, though it might have existed before him. A lot of Benjamin Franklin quotes are just quotes that existed at the time that he liked to use. He had so many phrases, it's hard to tell which ones were originally his and which ones he borrowed.
These ideas built upon Puritanism's commitment to popular government, and by embracing religious tolerance, corrected one of the movement's great failings. No less a Massachusetts man than John Adams credited progressive Puritanism as the catalyst for liberal democracy.
John Adams is often called a Puritan, and not in a nice way, so, I don't know.
The 1765 polemic, Adams argued that New Englanders of his time had much to learn about political agitation from their Puritan predecessors.
From the time of the Reformation to the first settlement of America, knowledge gradually spread in Europe, and especially in England, and in proportion as that increased and spread among the people, ecclesiastical and civil tyranny, which I use as synonymous expressions for the canon and feudal laws, seem to have lost their strength and weight. The people grew more and more sensible of the wrong that was done them by these systems, more and more impatient under it, and determined at all hazards to rid themselves of it. It was a resolution formed by a sensible people, I mean the Puritans, almost in despair. After their arrival here, they began their settlements and formed their plan both of ecclesiastical and civil government in direct opposition to the canon and the feudal systems. It may be thought polite and fashionable by many modern fine gentlemen perhaps to deride the characters of these persons as enthusiastical, superstitious, and republican, but such ridicule is founded in nothing but foppery and affectation.
And republican is being used in a negative sense in this. It's not a good word here. It's considered a bad word at the time.
And is grossly injurious and false. Religious to some degree of enthusiasm it may be admitted they were, but this can be no particular derogation from their character, because it was at the time almost the universal character, not only of England but of Christendom. Whatever imperfections may be justly ascribed to them, which however are as few as any mortals have discovered, their judgment in framing their policy was founded in wise, humane, and benevolent principles.
The radical gentleman terrorists of the American War of Independence, who have, rather unfortunately, been saddled with the stodgy sobriquet the Founding Fathers, understood that they were the inheritors of a long ideological legacy.
Fair critique.
They were grateful for that legacy, but well aware of its shortcomings. And when they set about building their own city on a hill, they utilized the ideas of their predecessors that resonated with them and discarded those ideas that didn't. The government they created was far from perfect, but it has proven to be remarkably durable, so far. Puritans were not single-handedly responsible for the democratic ideals of the Enlightenment, but they did lay the foundation of American political thought and prepared the way.
Yeah, foppery is thrown around a lot. It's a very effeminate term, I suppose, is the way of describing it. Kind of often given to people who are very conscious of their appearance, their behavior is a bit flamboyant, and they're often extravagant. Sometimes in their spending, they could be called fops. It's a very, very interesting word indeed.
Way for a revolution that profoundly impacted the course of world history. When the movement began, England was ruled arbitrarily by all-powerful despots and populated by a cowed underclass of illiterate tenants. Puritans transformed that kingdom into a constitutional monarchy and lifted the peasantry into a politically active citizenry with equality under the law. In America, Puritans attempted to create an ideal society. They failed, but their efforts led to the creation of the world's most successful and influential republic. Puritanism was a flawed philosophy, and Puritans were flawed people, as we all are. But they were also much, much more than angry witch hunters in buckled hats.
Bernice! Who is that? Stefan Milo. I know he's like an anthropologist. I know of his stuff, and I want to check out some of his stuff on here. Embrace Historia. I think I know that person. Histocrat. Like most of these people I've seen on like Twitter or whatever. Cool. Of course, gotta get his plugs. We'll let these roll by for a second. I need a moment to gather my thoughts. Because that was a lot. Actually, I'm going to mute this for now. Let these roll. I really enjoyed that video. I love these these long form things, which the live streaming stuff enables me to do more of, and I really find it a little easier to get through with you guys there with me. I really enjoyed that one. I'm very excited to check out his Witchfinder General video and his King Philip's War video. While he has his Civil War stuff, that's not really the stuff I really care to focus on as much. I think a lot of his other videos, hopefully stuff like closer to this, would probably appeal to me much more. So yeah, that was one of the best videos I've seen since I've started streaming, and I'm really happy with how that went. I don't know. I don't think I have any other thoughts on that. I shared most of my thoughts during, and there's other stuff around this that I'd like to explore a little bit more as we go forward.